So within one day, the specific numbers actually within 13 hours, we had 2 massacres in the United States. One was a white supremacist terror attack. That's the one that you see here over my left shoulder. And in Dayton, Ohio, there was a mass shooting. They're not sure the motive of that person yet, but he killed his sister and many other people. I believe it was at a bar. So within a very, very short time span, we have at least 29 people who were massacred. I believe 20 happened with the El Paso Walmart terrorist attack and 9 at the Dayton, Ohio shooting. Now, again, the Dayton, Ohio shooting, the motive is not clear. Twitter pulled down the guy's Twitter account. What's fascinating is that the dude was a leftist, a committed leftist. I read through a bunch of his tweets, and there's no mistaking it. Now, did he actually attack people in the name of that ideology? So is it a terror attack? Well, that we have no idea, because there was no, manifesto, political creed that was posted along with this attack. So I believe what law enforcement is thinking in the case of the Dayton, Ohio attack at the moment is that it was a mass shooter who was killing people because he's mentally deranged or whatever it might be. Now, it's possible that motive changes, and if so, we'll find out. But as of right now, it appears that that's the case. Now, in the case of the white supremacist terror attack in El Paso, there's nothing up in the air about that attack. The dude posted a political manifesto. I read through the manifesto, and it's crystal clear what he's doing. He believes in a white ethno-state. He says as much. He wants to set up a white ethno-state, and he calls, immigrants coming to this country an invasion, and he thinks that by massacring a bunch of them, it will be a disincentive for brown people to come to the United States of America. So no uncertain terms about that. It's a weird manifesto, because in the same manifesto, he talks about how, corporations now control the country. He talks about the degradation of our environment, which he's against. So it's a very strange stew of beliefs, because in a very similar way to maybe not necessarily Richard Spencer, but the other guy, Matthew Heimbach, who's the, head of, I think it's called the American Worker Party, although I could be mistaken about that. What they've done is they've mixed flat out white supremacist beliefs, and then they try to sprinkle in aspects of leftism to try to make it more appealing. So in other words, they believe in unions, and they're anti-Wall Street, and they're anti-war, and then they think that that's, a part of their ideology that will appeal to more people. And then, of course, there's a giant heaping dose of flat-out bigotry and xenophobia because they're advocating for a white ethno-state. This guy who did the terror attack in Dayton, it's a very similar thing. I read through the entire manifesto. And, it's clear that at the core of what he did is his racism and his xenophobia and his bigotry. And that's why he went to a Walmart in El Paso and just massacred brown people. So that's at the core of his ideology and why he acted. And again, it's crystal clear. And as we often see, this guy was basically inspired by and spurred on by previous white supremacist terrorists. And this is something it's a trend now. You see that people who do terror attacks are inspired by people who have done terror attacks. And it's hard to really, figure out exactly what the mechanism is, because some experts would argue, well, yeah, it's the ideology flat out that's, making this person do what they did. And others would argue it's a chicken or the egg type situation, and it's almost like they're vicious and murderous and they have this bloodlust, and then they just add on a rationalization later. And, I don't know which one of those things is true. And frankly, I don't care. All I know is it's a horrendous thing to see now on a regular basis. We have in this country not just mass shootings, but also white supremacist terror attacks. And, the statistics show that there are more right-wing terror attacks in this country than Islamic terror attacks. The counterpoint that people make to that is, well, yeah, but statistically only like 1% of the U.S. is Muslims. So, you still have a higher amount per capita of Islamic fundamentalist terror attacks. And that's a fair point. But yeah, when you have such a large pool of far right-wingers, white male far right-wingers, you can understand why the numbers show statistically that's a bigger threat. And of course, the government has defunded most efforts to track that kind of terrorism. And they've redirected and diverted funds more towards fighting Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. And, perhaps it would behoove you to spend some money on fighting white nationalist and white supremacist terror as well, because, again, we're seeing an uptick of this. And it is incredibly, incredibly disturbing. But the thing about this that was on another level to me is I wasn't even a little bit shocked. And that's scary. It's scary when it's like I almost had a lack of a reaction to it. It was almost like, what would you expect? And that should not ever be the case when we're dealing with something like just happened. I mean, again, 29 people dead in a 13-hour time span. One of them a mass shooting and another one a terror attack. My reaction shouldn't be like a shrug, but that's what it was. And that's painful. And that's devastating. Because what that shows is almost like a collective laziness in the nation, where we're failing to really grasp what's happening, where we're not doing the basic intellectual exercise of like, well, what if this was one of my loved ones? How would I feel? And, you likely would feel complete and utter despair mixed in with seething anger of our inability to prevent this stuff and stop it from happening on a regular basis. And, here's a thought that really got me. Stop and think about this. There's somebody out there. There are multiple people out there walking around right now, living their lives in the United States, going to work, going to the deli to pick up a sandwich, taking their kid to hockey practice, whatever it might be. And those people who are out there walking, eating, breathing, loving people, having friendships, going bowling, those people are going to be dead within the next 6 months from another mass shooting. And that's a guarantee. I could say 2 months, and that's probably true. But just for safety, for the time span, I'm going out to 6 months. Within the next half a year, somebody's out there who's going to get murdered in a mass shooting. And they have no clue. They're just living their life right now. And their life is going to be snatched from them in the most evil, vicious way imaginable. We know that's going to happen. And the government's not doing dick about it. Now, is there a cure-all fix? I don't think there is. I don't think there's one thing that would guarantee that, like, we never have a mass shooting again. I mean, I guess if you did total gun confiscation, maybe. There'd still be a few instances of guns slipping through the cracks and somebody committing a crime with them. I'm sure of that. So you're never going to guarantee it. But we do know there are ways to drastically, colossally, monumentally reduce the number of gun deaths. And they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. So that person who's out there right now walking around, just going about their business, and they're going to be gunned down within the next 6 months and murdered in cold blood, they have no idea. And nothing's going to be done to stop it, even though we definitely could take action that would drastically reduce the number of gun deaths. Now, this is a poll going all the way back to 2016, but I want to show you nonetheless because it's incredibly important. Take a look. So this is from Pew Research Center. I could have given you any of a number of polls because they all show basically the same thing. But look at this. Background checks for private and gun show sales, 81% favorite. Prevent people with mental illness from purchasing guns, 76% favorite. Barring gun purchases by people on the federal no-fly or watch list. That one might have some civil liberties concerns and might be slapped down in court, but nonetheless, 71% want it. Creating a federal database to track gun sales, 68% want it. Ban on assault weapons, 52% want it. For the record, there's another poll that came out much later, which now shows 60% of the American people want it. Ban on high-capacity ammunition clips. 50% want it, 47% don't want it. Again, to be fair, there's another poll that came out within the past year or two that has that number much higher. There are way more people who now support a ban on high-capacity magazines. Now, these are, very basic things. Have repeated, routine mental health checks, testing, verification processes in order for somebody to get a gun. And it's supported across the board in the United States. What a lot of people are surprised to learn is it's not just Democrats, it's not just independents, it's not just the country. It's also Republicans, it's also gun owners. Average, run-of-the-mill members of the NRA support many of these basic gun reforms. The only reason we don't get them put into law is very simply because the leadership of the NRA takes money from and represents the gun manufacturers. The gun manufacturers are quite literally the only group of people in the United States of America that doesn't want some form of gun reform. So the leadership of the NRA represents the gun manufacturers. The leadership of the NRA pays the Republican politicians, and there's strings attached. And the idea is, don't pass anything. Don't pass any new gun reform at all, no matter how basic it is, no matter how much, in some instances, over 90% of the American people agree with universal background checks. Don't care. Don't do it. Don't do any of it. So basically, we have democracy being subverted for authoritarian rule by moneyed interests. It's a very oligarchic, kleptocratic type system. And that's what we have. The corruption has made it so that a very tiny group of moneyed interests control our gun policy, when again, the people are crystal clear. I want to show you one more thing here because this is incredibly important. Here's how to buy a gun in the US versus New Zealand. So in the United States, you pass an instant background check that considers criminal convictions, domestic violence, and immigration status, and then you buy a gun. So you can get a gun the same day. Very simple approach. Now, this doesn't even take into account the gun show loophole, where oftentimes there is no background check. Private gun sales, same thing. Take a look at New Zealand. This is what it's like in New Zealand. And a lot of this was just added to the law in New Zealand as a result of the massacre they had there. Pass a background check that considers criminal, medical, mental health, and domestic violence records. Provide character references. Authorities interview or advise in person your partner or next of kin. Pass a home security inspection that checks for proper firearm storage. Take a gun safety course. Wait for approval for a firearms license, which could take weeks or months. Then buy a gun. Now, this article in the New York Times goes through what the process is in a bunch of developed countries. And what's fascinating is you'll see that in almost all of them, the process is a lot longer, a lot more complex, and it weeds out people a hell of a lot more. Now, this is where people say, well, but criminals aren't going to follow the gun laws, so why even implement those laws? That's a very silly reaction because you could use that logic to argue against all laws. Well, the people who are murderers are not going to follow the anti-murder laws, so why even have murder laws? So it's just, that's a really silly argument. But furthermore, it's about changing the numbers in the aggregate. And we know as a matter of fact that it will. So in other words, will there be some people who slip through the cracks, who end up getting guns and subverting the law in the process? Yes. But there will be many fewer people that do that in a situation where we have intelligent, strong laws and we enforce them. So you understand? It's about cutting down the number of gun deaths and mass shootings in the aggregate. And that will happen. So in other words, we have about 32,000 people that die every year from gun violence in the United States. Now, if we implement basic gun reforms, is that going to go down to 0? No. But if we implement basic gun reforms, can we potentially knock that down to 10,000 total gun deaths? Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So that's many lives saved, 22,000 lives saved. Now, I'm just making those numbers up and pulling them out of my ass. However, we know based on the evidence from other countries that it's a guarantee we will reduce the number of gun deaths for sure if we take these actions. By the way, 32,000 is the number of gun deaths when you include homicides, suicides, accidents, and all forms of gun deaths. When you look at just homicides, it's 10,000 homicides per year in the U.S. Take another developed country, the UK, 31 per year. 10,000 to 31. And it's not just a cultural difference, it's also a matter of the laws. So even if we say, okay, take the 10,000 homicides every year, with intelligent gun reform, can we knock that down to 5,000 and cut that number in half? Probably. You bet your ass we'll knock quite a bit of gun deaths off that, for sure. So, we're not asking for too much here, man. We're really not. We're really not. And it would drastically change the way our country is working right now. I mean, it really is to the point where it's just like every few months, there's some sort of massive slaughter, and then nothing happens. And we'll get to the Republican reaction in a little bit. Deeply disingenuous, incredibly stupid, infuriating. They're blaming something that has absolutely nothing to do with it. But this is where we're at now. This is where we're at. It doesn't matter how many times I come out here and show you, hey man, we all agree on these basic reforms. It doesn't matter how many times I hammer that point home. It doesn't matter how rock solid the argument is that we're making. There's basically going to be a collective shrug in Washington, D.C., and they're going to do Dickie McGee's acts. And of course, it goes without saying that perhaps a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric coming out of right-wing politicians should be reeled in a little bit. Because this guy used a lot of that language that, honestly, keep it real, man, you hear on Fox News on a regular basis. Our country is being infested. Trump said that the other day. Baltimore's infested. Well, that's classic dehumanization language. Trump and Fox News hosts refer to what's happening at the southern border as a, quote, invasion. Well, guess what? This guy calls it an invasion as well in his manifesto. So maybe you have to make clear that immigrants and refugees are human beings. And many of them are just trying to create a better life and work hard to support their families. The idea that they're like all bad, well, call it what it is. That's like the definition of racism and xenophobia and bigotry. He just thinks by virtue of their skin color, they are by definition evil, therefore I'm totally justified in massacring them. Has no idea that he's the evil one, obviously, to anybody with a functioning brain. And also, a lot of the immigrants and refugees who are coming into this country through the southern border, they're coming here to escape the consequences of many U.S. policies that have ravaged their respective countries. And that's the truth. Absolutely. Whether it's our foreign policy and our U.S. history in South America, I don't need to go into that for all you guys. You guys are educated on that topic. Or whether it's the drug war and the absolute destruction of many of those countries to the south of us, where a lot of them are narco states. I believe Honduras and El Salvador, fact check me on this if I'm wrong, because I'm digging back in the memory bank here, but I think about 2 years ago, I read a fact that living in those countries was more dangerous than being in Iraq at the height of the Iraq War. More likely to be killed in El Salvador or Honduras on any given day compared to being in Iraq at the height of the Iraq War. Think about that. And then people escape here to get away from like certain death, extreme poverty, or a narco gang obliterating them. They escape here, and what do? We slam the door in their face and we lecture them about waiting in line and go through the proper process. Well, what if the process is, oh my God, I need asylum, so I'm going to show up, and then we'll deal with everything once we get there? What if that's the process? But there's been a lot of dehumanization of black and brown people, refugees, immigrants, and it's grotesque, man. And this is the logical consequence to that. You have people who, and a lot of those Republican politicians, I'm sure, would just, like, they think, what do you mean? No, I'm just, like, this is just me playing politics to try to get elected, to say, I'm for America, and I'm for Americans, and I'm not for no damn illegals. And they use it as a tactic, but then the consequences of that are, there's a lot of true Kool-Aid drinkers out there who really think, like, no. All of the people coming in this country are criminals, and they're rapists. And like Trump said in his launch speech, what did he say? People coming in this country, they're criminals, they're rapists. I assume some are good people. So in other words, he flipped it. He said, like, most are criminals and rapists, and some are good people. It's the exact opposite. The overwhelming majority are normal people. They're good people. Only a tiny amount are criminals. So anyway, Trump just gave a speech where he was like, suddenly now he's like, me? Oh no, I'm totally presidential, bro. Listen, I'm against bigotry, I'm against racism, and we have to be clear that white supremacy is evil. Cut to a video that, from one of his rallies that was within the last month, where somebody screamed to shoot him at the border. Somebody in the crowd screamed, shoot him at the border when they show up, unannounced. And Trump laughed and then said, only in the Florida Panhandle can you get away with saying something like that. Only in the Florida Panhandle. Well, it turns out there are plenty of people out there who aren't joking. They really believe, no, shoot them. Shoot them when they show up. And of course, in this instance, you have a mass shooter who doesn't even care about their immigration status. All he cares about is brown. They're brown, so they're bad. And they're stealing my future. What everybody needs to understand is this is the oldest trick in the book. You have elites pointing the finger at poor and middle class black and brown people and convincing white people, usually middle class or lower class, convincing them that all of your problems can be pinned on the black and brown people. They're the problem. They're taking all your money through welfare. They're stealing your jobs. By the way, I like that little contradiction there. What is it? Are they coming here and working and stealing your job so they're hardworking, or are they coming here and they're just sitting back and sipping a Coke and taking welfare money? Which is it? They don't care. The bottom line is, I have problems. I'm going to blame them. They're the root of all my problems, when in reality, we know damn well the root of everybody's problems in this country, pin it right back on the corruption. Right back on the government being bought and owned by billionaires and corporations, and they rig the rules in their favor. The reality is, you have a hell of a lot more in common with those black and brown people you despise than you think you do. I mean, you guys need to be on the same team, because the elites are dividing and conquering. But for a guy like this, obviously he was totally brainwashed and too far gone, and it's abysmal. We're not going to change everybody's mind overnight. There's still going to be vicious bigots and racists and xenophobes out there, and people who are totally mentally unstable and on the brink of doing a mass shooting. We can't change their minds overnight, and some people are impossible to change. But what we can do is make it a hell of a lot less likely that they get their hands on the weaponry to carry out such an atrocity.